In April 1908, Jasper Darnell drove his wagon up the Tuckasegee River Road with everything he owned: a wife named Flora, 3 children, a milk cow, 2 laying hens, and a blue tick hound named Captain. He had purchased 120 acres in a hollow that bore his family's name. His grandfather had held the original land grant, and he intended to farm it. He was strong, experienced, and well provisioned. He made it exactly as far as the hollow's mouth. Captain, who had been trotting beside the wagon since Silva, stopped. His ears flattened. His hackles rose. He sat down in the road and would not move. Jasper called him, whistled, pulled his collar. Captain, who had never disobeyed a command in his life, looked at his master, looked at the hollow, and began to howl. Flora Darnell, who had grown up with dogs and trusted their judgment in ways that some people considered superstitious, turned to Jasper and said, "If the dog won't go, we shouldn't either." Jasper, who trusted his own judgment over any animals, drove the wagon into the hollow without Captain. This was the first of several decisions he would come to regret. The road into Darnell, Hollow, if you could call it that, was more of a memory of a road. 2 ruts in the earth left by some wagon that had passed through years before and never returned. It angled northwest off the main Tuckasegee River Road, squeezed between 2 ridges of second-growth oak and hemlock, and narrowed as it went until the wagon's wheels were nearly brushing the bank on either side. The children, Eli, 9 years old, Nora, 7, and little Thomas, not yet 5, had been boisterous and full of questions all morning, racing ahead of the wagon and chasing squirrels off the road. But as they followed the wagon into the hollow's mouth, they quieted. Eli, the oldest, reached back and took Nora's hand without being asked. Thomas climbed onto the wagon seat and pressed himself against his mother's arm. "It's pretty," Nora said after a moment. She was not wrong. The hollow was extraordinary. Even in early April, with the hardwoods still in their first tentative leaf, you could see the shape of the place and understand immediately why a man would want to own it. The ridges on either side were high enough to block the prevailing westerly winds, but not so high as to block the sun. The creek that ran down the hollow's center, Darnell Creek, unnamed by anyone official but called that by the family, was clear and cold and quick over a bed of gray limestone and blue-black slate. The bottomland on either side of the creek, where the hollow widened, was deep and dark and looked as rich as any soil in Jackson County. There were ancient tulip poplars along the creek bank, trunks 6 feet across, and a grove of massive chestnuts on the eastern slope that would have been worth considerable money in timber if Jasper had wanted to sell them, which he did not. He had not come here to strip the land. He had come to live on it. Grandfather was right, Jasper said, to no one in particular. His grandfather, Elias Darnell, had taken out the original land grant on this hollow sometime in the 1840s, during the great push of Scots, Irish, and English settlers into the southern Appalachian valleys. Old Elias had never built on the land, had surveyed it, paid his taxes on it, passed it down, but had apparently spoken of it often enough that Jasper, his grandson, had grown up with a specific and vivid image of what the hollow looked like. The image matched the reality almost exactly. What Jasper did not know, could not have known, was why old Elias had never built on it. The cabin went up in 3 weeks. Jasper was a skilled carpenter and had brought good tools, and there was no shortage of timber. He felled the poplars he needed from a stand on the hollow's western slope, choosing trees that were straight and sound. And he notched them himself and raised the walls with the help of 2 neighbors who came down from the ridge communities above the Tuckasegee. The cabin was solid, 16 feet by 20, with a sleeping loft for the children and a stone fireplace that drew well. Flora planted a kitchen garden in the bottomland nearest the cabin while Jasper and the neighbors worked, and she reported that the soil was almost unnaturally dark and rich, crumbling between her fingers like something from a river delta rather than a mountain hollow. She planted her seeds deeper than she normally would because the soil was soft enough to accept them. The first month was, by every observable measure, a success. The soil was fertile beyond anything Jasper had farmed in the main valley. The spring planting took hold quickly and grew with a vigor that Flora described in letters to her mother as almost alarming. The beans were climbing their poles a full 2 weeks ahead of schedule. The corn was already knee-high in early May, and the kitchen garden looked like something from a seed catalog illustration. The creek water was clean and cold, tested by Jasper simply by drinking it, which was the test that mattered to a man in 1908. The hollow's microclimate, sheltered from wind on 3 sides, was noticeably warmer than the main valley. Warm enough that Jasper planted a second planting of summer squash that he would never have attempted on an exposed hillside farm. Captain, who had been left with their nearest neighbors, the Cogburns, on the ridge above, escaped on the 3rd day and made it all the way to the hollow's mouth before one of the Cogburn boys caught him. He was howling when they found him, sitting at the hollow's entrance with his nose pointed into the dark between the ridges, howling in a way that the Cogburn boy, 14 years old, not easily spooked, later described as not like any dog I ever heard before. Not like he was scared. Like he was warning something. The Cogburns brought Captain back and tied him. He chewed through the rope. They tied him again, this time with a logging chain, and he accepted it. But for the rest of that first month, whenever the wind blew from the northwest, he would sit up straight and his hackles would rise, and he would begin to tremble, slowly, like a man trying to hold himself still against a shiver. Flora noticed. She wrote about Captain in the same letters to her mother that described the miraculous garden. "The dog knows something we don't," she wrote in the careful, slightly formal hand she used for correspondence. "Jasper says I'm being foolish. The dog is probably just adjusting to being separated from us. But I have never seen Captain tremble. He is the steadiest animal I have ever known. He faced down a black bear 2 years ago, up on the ridge, above Cullowhee, and never shook. He shakes now, when the wind comes from our hollow." The headaches began in June. They came at night, arriving somewhere around 2 or 3 in the morning, and intensifying until dawn, then fading as the sun came up, and the day warmed. At first, Jasper attributed them to the change in altitude. They were higher here than in Silva, where they'd been living in a rented house. Then he attributed them to the unaccustomed labor of building and clearing. Then, as they persisted into July, he blamed the well water, and he moved the family to drinking exclusively from the creek. The headaches did not change. Flora's were worse than Jasper's. She would lie awake in the pre-dawn hours, pressing her hands against her temples, trying to count the pain down by increments the way her mother had taught her to manage labor. The children were irritable and restless in a way that was unlike them. Eli, who was generally calm and bookish for his age, was short-tempered and weepy. Nora, who had been an excellent sleeper since infancy, was waking in the night and refusing to go back to sleep without a lamp lit. And Thomas, the youngest, had developed a persistent ringing in his ears that he described as a bell, but underground. A bell underground, Flora repeated when Thomas told her this. She was standing at the kitchen garden, hoeing between the bean rows, and she stopped and looked at him with an expression that Jasper, who was watching from across the clearing, could not read. "What does it sound like, the bell?" she asked Thomas. Thomas thought about it. He was not quite 5 and did not yet have the vocabulary for nuance. "Big," he said finally. "Real big bell. Real far down." Jasper told Flora that Thomas was too young to sleep properly, that the altitude was still adjusting everyone's blood, that the headaches were a seasonal thing that would pass. He believed these things when he said them, or tried to. He was a man of great confidence in his own perceptions and his own interpretations of events, which is both a strength and a particular kind of blindness. He had invested everything, every dollar from the sale of the Silva house, every favor owed by neighbors who had helped him build, in this hollow and this farm. And the idea that the hollow itself was the problem was one that his mind rejected, not as false, but as unaffordable. He could not afford for the hollow to be the problem. The milk cow's production dropped in July. She had been giving 3 gallons a day through June, which was normal for a good dairy cow on good summer pasture. And then, in the second week of July, she dropped to 2 gallons, then 1, then less than a quart. Jasper checked her for mastitis, found none. Checked her for signs of pregnancy, found none. Changed her pasture, supplemented her grain. She continued to decline. The chickens stopped laying in August, all at once, as though they had made a collective decision. Jasper walked into the henhouse one morning and found them standing in a tight cluster in the far corner, pressed against the wall, making a low sound he had never heard chickens make before. Not clucking, not the low muttering of sleeping hens, but something with a rhythm to it, almost like breathing. He stood in the henhouse door and watched them for a while. The hens watched him back with their small bright eyes, and they did not move, and they did not stop making the sound. He did not tell Flora about the hens. He told himself the heat was affecting them. It was August, and the hollow, with its shelter from wind, was warmer than the surrounding mountains in summer, and heat stressed laying hens. He told himself this, and he went back to his work, which was the work of a man who has made a decision and cannot afford to reconsider it. Flora began having nightmares in August. They were not varied nightmares, not the jumbled, surreal productions of ordinary dreaming, but the same dream, night after night, with the consistency of a message repeated by someone who doubts they are being heard. In the dream, she was underground. Not buried, there was no sense of confinement or coffin, but moving through a space that was below the earth, a tunnel or a cave, in complete darkness. She could not see, but she could hear, and what she heard was breathing. Not her own breathing, something else's breathing, deep, slow, rhythmic, and vast. Not the breathing of any animal she knew, but the breathing of something much larger than an animal, something so large that what she could hear was only one small part of a respiration cycle, one exhalation in a breath that took minutes to complete. She would walk toward the sound in the dream, because what else do you do in the dark but walk toward the only thing you can hear, and the sound would grow louder, and just before she woke, she would feel, not hear, not see, but feel with her whole body, a trembling in the rock around her, as though the earth itself were vibrating. And she would understand in the dream that the breathing and the trembling were the same thing, that the earth was alive in some deep and terrible way, and that she was inside it. She woke from these dreams sweating, heart pounding, with the headache already beginning its slow press against the backs of her eyes. She would lie still and listen to the hollow outside the cabin windows, and sometimes, not always, but often enough, she would hear something, not the breathing from the dream, not that, but a low, felt more than heard resonance, like the lowest note of the largest organ imaginable, played very quietly, far away beneath the ground. It lasted minutes, sometimes longer. Then it stopped. She did not tell Jasper about the sound. She told her journal, which she kept in a flour sack under the bed. September brought the nosebleeds. They started with Nora, an ordinary-looking nosebleed on a Tuesday morning, the kind that any child gets, the kind you tilt the head back for and press a cloth against and wait. But it lasted 40 minutes. Flora stood in the kitchen with her daughter's head tipped back and the cloth getting redder, and Nora whimpering quietly, and then simply being quiet, exhausted by the bleeding. And Flora counted the minutes by the sound of the creek outside, and felt something shift in her understanding of the situation. This was the 19th week in the hollow. 18 weeks of headaches and restless children, and a cow that gave no milk, and chickens that would not lay, and a dog that trembled at the hollow's edge, and a dream she had every night about the breathing earth. 19 weeks. And now her daughter's nose would not stop bleeding. Eli had his first nosebleed 2 days later. Thomas had his the following week, and it was worse than the other two, 30 minutes before it stopped, and the boy was so pale afterward that Flora kept him in bed for the rest of the day and sat beside him and held his hand. And when Jasper came in from the field and saw her face, he stopped in the doorway and did not speak. "Tell me again that we're adjusting," Flora said. Jasper looked at his son in the bed, at his wife's face, at the cloth on the table that had been white that morning and was not white anymore. He did not say anything. "Tell me again that it's the altitude," Flora said. "Tell me it's the water, and we can fix it by boiling. Tell me what it is, Jasper, because I have been here 19 weeks and I cannot tell you. I have been watching this place for 19 weeks, and I cannot tell you what is wrong with it, only that something is. Only that the dog knew before any of us, only that I knew when Captain sat down at the mouth and would not come in, and I said so, and you drove us in anyway." The county doctor came out in October. He was a man named Whitfield, who practiced out of Silva and rode a circuit through the mountain communities every few weeks. He examined the children, listened to their chests, asked about the nosebleeds and the headaches and the sleep disturbances. He had no diagnosis. "Miasma," he said, which was the 1908 word for something in the air that makes you sick, a concept that predated germ theory by 100 years, but was not entirely wrong. as a description of a phenomenon, even if it was wrong about the mechanism. The hollow may have bad air. Some places do. The old-timers knew this. There are hollows in these mountains that nobody settles for just that reason. The air goes bad in them, gets stale and sits. Usually it's worse in winter, when there's no wind to move things through. What do we do about it? Flora asked. Leave, said Dr. Whitfield. Jasper's jaw tightened. Dr. Whitfield saw this and softened his recommendation. Or sleep with the windows open, even in cold weather. Keep a fire burning all night to circulate the air. Limit the time you spend indoors. He paused. But yes, if you have the means to move and the symptoms persist, I would move. Some land isn't meant to be lived on. The mountains have places like that. This may be one of them. Jasper did not move. He had not yet fully committed to the conviction that the hollow was the problem. Had not, if we're being honest, committed fully to that possibility. Even by October, with the nosebleeds and the headaches and the silent chickens and the cow that gave no milk. A man with everything invested in a place is not easily moved to conclude that the place is wrong. What Jasper saw when he looked at the hollow was not what the hollow was, but what it was supposed to be, what it could be, what it looked like on paper and in memory, and in the story his grandfather had told. He saw the rich soil and the clean creek and the sheltered microclimate. He saw the investment and the future and the name, his name, the family's name, Darnell Hollow, and these things were very hard to look past. Flora left in November, just after the first hard frost. She did not announce it as a departure. She framed it as a visit, a winter trip to see her mother, taking the children out of the hollow for some fresh air and a change of scenery, while the hardest weeks of winter settled in. But she packed everything that mattered, the children's clothes, the family Bible, the good china her grandmother had left her, her journal from under the bed. And when Jasper helped load the wagon, she watched him carefully, not sure whether he understood that she was not coming back. He understood. He did not say so, but he understood, the way you understand things you cannot bear to say out loud. Come with us, she said at the hollow's mouth. The morning was cold and gray, and the wagon stood in the ruts with the children bundled together in the bed, and behind them the hollow breathed its cold, invisible breath. I can't leave, Jasper said. We'd lose the land. We'd keep our children, Flora said. She meant this as an argument, a logical counter, but it came out sounding like what it actually was. A verdict. Jasper stood at the wagon wheel and did not answer. Flora clicked to the horse, and the wagon moved out onto the Tuckasegee Road, and when they reached the place where Captain was staying, the hound heard the wagon before he saw it and was on his feet and moving before the Cogburn boy, who was walking him, could do anything about it. Captain ran to the road and ran alongside the wagon, trying to lick the children's hands through the boards, his tail a white blur. Flora stopped the wagon and lifted him up to the children, who buried themselves in his neck and cried. Captain licked their faces with great thoroughness and did not tremble at all. Jasper stayed through January. He stayed alone in the cabin he had built, in the hollow that bore his name, and he worked the winter work. Split wood, patched the roof, reinforced the henhouse against the cold. The chickens had begun laying again, spottily, now that the weather had driven them entirely indoors, which removed them from whatever the bottomland pasture was doing to them. The cow had stopped giving milk entirely and stood in her small field with a look Jasper associated with animals that had given up on something. He milked her anyway, out of habit, and got nothing, and stood in the cold field scratching her ears and looking at the ridgelines above the hollow. The winter nights were the worst. In summer, the hollow was merely uncomfortable. The headaches, the odd resonance in the walls, the sense of something pressing against the underside of sleep. In winter, with the cabin sealed against the cold, with no wind to move the air, and the temperature inversions settling over the narrow valley like a lid on a jar, the nights were something else entirely. Jasper would wake at 2 or 3 in the morning with the headache already crushing, and he would lie in the silence of the hollow and feel, distinctly feel, the vibration in the cabin floor and walls that was not the wind and not the creak and not any animal moving in the dark outside. It was a trembling, steady, rhythmic, deep, like something breathing, like something large moving just below the surface of the ground, turning in the dark. He tried to find rational explanations for it. Distant traffic on the river road. No, there was no traffic at 2 in the morning, not in January. A water table shift caused by the cold. Possible. But he'd never heard of a water table that vibrated. Trees settling in the frost. No, this was not that sound. Not the crack and pop of freezing wood, but something different. Something sustained. Something with a pulse. He wrote it in a small notebook he kept on the table, because he was a man who wrote things down. And what he wrote was, night vibration, not wind, not creak, not animal. Like engine, but no engine here. Feels like ground is moving, but ground is not moving. Have felt it 6 nights now. He left on a Wednesday in February. He did not tell anyone he was leaving. He woke at 4 in the morning with the headache like a spike through both temples and the vibration in the walls and something else, a new sensation or a new awareness of the vibration's character. A feeling he would try to describe to neighbors for years afterward with imperfect success as the ground itself seeming to move, not like an earthquake, not sharp and startling, but slow and purposeful, like something underground was shifting its weight. He packed what he could carry in a saddlebag, left the cow and the chickens, and walked out of the hollow in the pre-dawn dark. He did not look back. He walked to the Cogburns farm on the ridge, and when their dog came out to meet him in the yard, he sat down in the dirt of the path and put his face in the dog's neck and stayed there for a long time, the dog accepting this without surprise or discomfort, as dogs do when they sense a man has reached the bottom of something. Captain was there. He came out of the barn when he heard Jasper sit down, and he walked to his master and sat beside him in the dirt, and the two of them sat in the cold, pre-dawn, and did not move for a while. Jasper's hand was on Captain's back, and he could feel that the dog was not trembling. Here, on the ridge, well away from the hollow's mouth, there was nothing to tremble about. You knew, Jasper said to the dog. Captain looked at him. You knew the whole time and I wouldn't listen to you, Jasper said. He said this to a dog at 4 in the morning in the dark of a February hillside in Jackson County, North Carolina. The dog put his head in Jasper's lap, which was about all the response a dog could give. It was, if not quite forgiveness, something adjacent to it. Jasper Darnell never went back into the hollow. He and Flora reconciled at her mother's house in Cullowhee, and they farmed the ridge for the rest of their lives, and Jasper spoke of Darnell Hollow only rarely and always in a specific way, not as a haunted place, not in the language of the supernatural, but in the language of a man who has been bested by something he didn't understand. "There's something wrong with the ground down there," he would say. "I don't know what, but the ground is wrong. The dog knew it before any of us, and I was too proud to listen to the dog." He paid the taxes on the hollow for another 20 years, partly because he could not bear to sell land that bore his name to someone else who might try to live on it, and partly because he couldn't entirely let go of the vision of what the place should have been. The rich bottomland, the clear creek, the sheltered microclimate, the extraordinary soil that had grown his beans and corn with a vigor he had never matched anywhere else. The hollow was not just wrong, it was beautiful and wrong, which is a harder combination to abandon than something that is simply and plainly wrong without apology. He died in 1941, and the land passed to his son Eli, who had been 9 years old on the wagon ride into the hollow, and who retained from that experience a specific and enduring aversion to enclosed spaces, particularly ones that narrowed, which he understood as a personal quirk and not as a response to a childhood exposure to high concentrations of a radioactive noble gas. Eli held the land for 7 years and then sold it in 1948 to a man named Curtis Parton, who had a son named Samuel. But before we get to the Partons, there is something else to say about the hollow, something that has nothing to do with the Darnells and everything to do with the land itself and with the people who understood it before the Darnells ever arrived. Something that the hollow's geography makes clear. If you know how to read geography the way the people who lived in these mountains for centuries learned to read it. The hollow is not unusual in the southern Appalachians in being beautiful. The mountains are full of beauty and full of danger, and the two are not opposites. They are often the same thing, wearing different faces at different hours of the day. What is unusual about Darnell Hollow is the specific combination of its beauties and its dangers, the precise geology that makes it both the most fertile bottomland in Jackson County and the most quietly lethal, and the fact that the people who knew this, who had known it for generations before the first Scots-Irish settler took out a land grant on any of these ridges, are still here and will tell you, if you ask in the right way, what their ancestors called the place and why they stayed away. The eastern band of Cherokee Indians have lived in the southern Appalachians for thousands of years. They are not visitors to this landscape and never have been. The Tuckasegee River Valley, Tuckasegee being an anglicization of a Cherokee word that approximates the place of the swift water, was Cherokee territory. When the first European explorers came through in the 1540s, and it remained Cherokee territory in every meaningful sense, even after the land seizures and the removal, because the eastern band, those who escaped the Trail of Tears by hiding in these mountains, or by legal maneuvering, or by sheer determined refusal to go, stayed. They are still here. The Qualla boundary, the land held in trust for the eastern band by the federal government, sits at the eastern boundary of what is now the Great Smoky Mountains National Park, less than 30 miles from the mouth of Darnell Hollow. The people who know this land the best have lived on it continuously, in one form or another, for longer than any European nation has existed. George Owl was not yet born when the Darnells tried to settle the hollow, and failed. He was born in 1929, on the Kuala boundary, to a family that had maintained their connection to the old knowledge through the disruptions of removal, forced schooling, and assimilation pressure, with the stubborn tenacity of people who understand that knowledge is survival. He grew up speaking both Cherokee and English, learning the stories of the landscape from his grandfather and his grandfather's contemporaries, men who had been born in the years just after the Civil War, who had themselves learned from men born before the removal. Chains of knowledge passed mouth to ear across generations in the way that mountains pass their shapes to rivers. Slowly, completely, without written instructions. George Owl became, in the 1960s and 1970s, one of the Eastern Band's primary cultural liaisons with the outside world. Not a spokesman, exactly, but a translator. A man who could explain Cherokee knowledge to non-Cherokee researchers in terms that those researchers could engage with without misrepresenting it. He was careful and precise in this work, and he was not, despite what some researchers expected, unwilling to share. He was willing to share almost everything. He was simply unwilling to allow what he shared to be misrepresented or decontextualized, to have the knowledge stripped from its framework and repackaged as quaint folklore or primitive science, when it was, in his view, neither quaint nor primitive, but simply a different and equally rigorous method of arriving at truths about the physical world. He knew about Darnell Hollow. His grandfather had known about it, and his grandfather's grandfather, and back further than that, to the earliest stories of the Cherokee relationship with this part of the Tuckasegee Valley. The hollow had a name in Cherokee. He would explain it to a researcher in 1979 after the USGS survey, and his explanation would be one of the most important documents produced about the hollow. But the name had been in use, and the avoidance had been in practice, long before any researcher came to ask about it. The Cherokee did not go into the hollow. They had not gone into it as far back as oral tradition reached, which was considerably further back than 1908. The name, George Owl would explain, translated most accurately as the breathing ground. Not the ground that breathes, as in a poetic metaphor for living earth, but the breathing ground, as a specific description of a specific phenomenon that could be observed by anyone with sufficient time and attention. The ground in the hollow breathed. Air came up from it. The air was not good air. Animals avoided it. People who went in came out sick. The Cherokee had a sophisticated vocabulary for describing different categories of bad air. Air that came from standing water, which caused certain kinds of illness. Air that came from the earth itself, which caused different kinds of illness. Air that came from decaying organic matter, which caused still others. The air in Darnell Hollow fell into the second category. Earth air, the kind that seeped up from faults and fissures and was, as George Owl put it in 1979, not made for breathing. Not poison that kills you fast. Poison that makes you wrong inside, slowly, over seasons. The Cherokee had arrived at this understanding through observation over generations. They had watched animals avoid the hollow, not just dogs, but deer, bear, turkey, the whole repertoire of mountain wildlife that should have used the hollow's rich bottomland and clear water as prime foraging territory. The absence of large animals in a place with excellent food and water resources is a signal, if you know how to read it. They had watched the few people who had spent extended time in the hollow become ill in characteristic ways. The headaches, the nosebleeds, the disturbed sleep, the vague but progressive malaise. They had made the connection between the earth air and the illness, and they had decided, sensibly and correctly, that the hollow was not a place to stay. They communicated this decision across generations in the form of the hollow's name and its associated story. This place breathes bad breath. Do not live here. This is not superstition. This is epidemiology. And it is worth pausing here to let that land, because it is one of the things this story is actually about. The way in which knowledge that was arrived at through observation and codified in oral tradition and dismissed by settlers as native superstition turns out, when examined through the lens of Western scientific method with its instruments and its chemical analysis, to be exactly right. The Cherokee did not know about radon. They had no concept of radioactive noble gases or geological fault systems, or the physics of atmospheric inversion. But they had spent enough time in the mountains, watching carefully, that they had correctly identified a place that was dangerous, correctly attributed the danger to the earth itself, and correctly maintained the practice of avoidance for long enough to pass it across the generations intact. The knowledge survived the removal, survived the forced assimilation, survived everything, and was waiting in George Owl's memory when the USGS team needed it. The dog knew. The Cherokee knew. Western science, with its land grants and its county surveys and its mining inspectors, did not know. But we are getting ahead of the story. The Partons came next, and the Partons, to their credit, came closer to understanding than anyone had before. Curtis Parton bought the hollow land in 1948, but it was his son Samuel who actually tried to live on it. Samuel Parton was 41 years old in 1948. A lean, deliberate man with the kind of stillness that some veterans acquire. Not the stillness of ease, but the stillness of a man who learned to move carefully, to be sure of what he was doing before he did it, because in certain places and at certain times, moving without thinking got you killed. He had been at the Meuse Argonne in 1918, which he did not talk about, and he had come home from that experience with his body intact and his nerves altered in ways that the medical vocabulary of 1919 did not yet have words for. He farmed and was good at it, and he was patient with difficulty in a way that had more to do with his war experience than with his nature, which was, at bottom, a sharply curious one. Samuel Parton wanted to understand things. He wanted to know how they worked. This quality had served him reasonably well in his life. It served him particularly well in Darnell Hollow. He moved in with his wife, Cora, and their two youngest children. The older ones were grown and gone in the spring of 1932. The Depression had come fully down on Jackson County by then, and the Hollow's land, with its reputation for rich soil and natural shelter, looked like a genuine opportunity to a man trying to hold his family together through a contraction that showed no signs of ending. The price Curtis Parton had paid for it in 1948 was low, even by Depression standards, and the price he asked Samuel for it was lower, a father's gift wrapped in the form of a land transfer. Samuel had spent the spring of 1932 clearing the cabin site and assessing the bottomland, and reading whatever he could find about soil chemistry and microclimate farming. Because Samuel was the kind of man who read about things before he did them, he had 2 dogs, both of them mountain curs. The mixed breed working dogs of the southern Appalachians, bred over generations for versatility and toughness, the dogs that treed bears and hunted hogs and herded cattle and slept at the foot of the bed and kept the children company and did everything that needed doing that a man's hands and feet couldn't manage. Their names were Jude and Mavis. Jude was the bigger of the 2, 3 years old, scarred from a boar encounter, but unbothered by it. Mavis was older, 7 years, and had the calm authority of a dog past middle age who has seen enough to have opinions. Both dogs refused the hollow. This was more complicated than it sounds, because mountain curs are not the sort of dogs that refuse things easily. They are bred for going into difficult places, into dense brush after game, into dark caves after bear, into tight spaces after whatever needs to come out of them. A mountain cur that plants its feet and will not move is communicating something specific and serious, because that is not what mountain curs do. It would be like a draft horse refusing to pull. Jude stopped at the hollow's mouth and shivered. Mavis sat down, tucked her tail, and looked up at Cora Parton with an expression that Cora would later describe with some exactitude as apologetic. She looked at me like she was sorry she couldn't do what I needed, Cora said. Like she understood I wanted her to come in, and she wished she could, but she couldn't. It wasn't stubbornness. It was fear, deep fear, the kind you can't argue with. Samuel had heard of the Darnells. Silva was a small town, and Jackson County was a small county, and the story of the family that had tried to live in the hollow and left had been part of the local oral history for 20 years by 1932, told and retold in the particular way of mountain communities, where stories of what happened to people on specific pieces of land are not merely gossip, but practical information. He had heard the story as a version of the supernatural. Most people who retold it framed it as a haunting, or as the hollow being cursed, or as some Cherokee spirit that objected to settlement. And he had discounted this framing because Samuel Parton did not believe in hauntings or curses or offended spirits. But he had noted the information underneath the framing. A family had gotten sick there. The dogs hadn't wanted to go in. He left Jude and Mavis with his daughter's family in Silva. He and Cora and the 2 children moved into the hollow in late April of 1932. The bottomland was still extraordinary. That never changed about the hollow. The richness of the soil, the temperature of the air, the clarity of the creek. The chestnuts that had been old growth in 1908 were gone now. The blight had come through the Appalachians in the 1920s, killing every chestnut from Maine to Georgia in one of the greatest ecological catastrophes in North American history. But the stumps of them were still there, massive discs of gray wood slowly returning to the earth, and the bottomland between them was dark and deep and exactly as fertile as it had always been. Samuel planted corn and beans and a generous kitchen garden, and watched the first 2 weeks of growth with the eye of a man who knows soil, and was impressed against his better judgment. The headaches began on the 18th day. Samuel noted this in the small journal he kept, because Samuel Parton was a man who kept records. He noted the date, the intensity on a scale he invented for himself, the time of onset, the time of resolution. He noted that the headaches came at night and resolved in the morning. He noted that Cora's were severe enough to keep her from sleep, and that the children were irritable and slow in a way he associated with illness. He noted that his own headaches were different from headaches he'd had before. Not the sharp pain of a tension headache or the pounding of a fever headache, but something more diffuse, more pressure than pain. Like the entire interior of his skull was being gently squeezed. He noted that they resolved completely by mid-morning, without exception, and returned without exception each night. He did not note in the journal that the experience reminded him of something. He did not write it down because he was not yet sure enough of the comparison to commit it to paper, and because the comparison, if accurate, was alarming enough that he wanted to be certain before he named it. He had been at the Meuse, Argonne. He had been through the gas attacks of the fall of 1918, and he had survived them. And he had spent the rest of his war career and a considerable amount of his peacetime life understanding what gas did to a man. He understood the difference between phosgene and chlorine and mustard, understood the different ways they attacked the body, understood the symptoms of each and the progressions of each and the treatments of each. He had this knowledge because surviving gas warfare required it, and because after surviving it, he had spent years trying to understand what had happened to him and to the men around him, as a way of processing an experience that his generation had no other framework for processing. The symptoms at Darnell Hollow were not identical to gas exposure. They were milder, much milder, and the mechanism was clearly different. But there were parallels that a man who had stood in a trench filling with invisible, heavier-than-air gas and watched his companions fall could not ignore. The headaches, the nosebleeds. Cora had had 2 by the end of May, and the younger child had had 1. The disrupted sleep, the sense of pressure, of something wrong with the air itself, even though the air looked fine. The way the symptoms concentrated in the night hours and resolved with the morning. The way the bottomland of the hollow, like the low ground of a trench, seemed to collect something that the higher ridges did not. He tested the well water. He had no chemical testing equipment, but he had a practical miner's vocabulary for water quality, and he ran the tests he knew how to run: taste, smell, appearance, the behavior of soap in it, the way it affected the color of iron implements left in it, and found nothing abnormal. Clean water, clear water, water that tasted like what it was, cold limestone-filtered mountain water. Not the problem. He tested the soil. Same results. The soil was dark and clean and rich, not the leached heavy soil around industrial contamination, not discolored or oddly textured or smelling of anything it shouldn't smell of. Just very good mountain bottomland. Not the problem. Then he tested the air. The test he used was the candle test, which he knew from conversations with miners, men who worked the coal and iron mines of the southern Appalachians, and who had a rich practical knowledge of underground air quality that predated any formal chemistry. A miner who wanted to know if a shaft had bad air took a candle down with him. If the candle burned well and bright, the air was safe. If the flame grew small and blue, there was not enough oxygen. If the flame went out without warning, there was gas, probably carbon dioxide or methane, displacing the oxygen. The test worked because fire, like any animal, needed oxygen to breathe, and when the oxygen was displaced by another gas, the fire told you. Samuel set a candle on the cabin's center table one night in early June, lit it, and went to bed. He woke at 2 in the morning, woke with the headache, which was his alarm clock in this place, and looked at the candle. It was still burning, but the flame was small, half the size it should have been, and distinctly blue at its base, and it trembled, not from any draft, but from the instability of a flame competing for oxygen it was not getting enough of. As he watched, it shrank further. At 3:30 in the morning, it went out. Samuel lay in the dark for a while, feeling the headache, listening to the hollow, feeling the trembling in the cabin floor that was so subtle you could convince yourself it wasn't there unless you were lying very still in total silence in the pre-dawn hours. Then he got up, went to the bedroom where Cora and the children were sleeping, opened both windows as wide as they would go, went through the rest of the cabin opening every window and the door, and came back and sat at the table in the cross-draft and waited for the headache to ease. It took 2 hours. By full dawn, it was gone. By mid-morning, with the sun on the hollow and the air moving freely through the open cabin, the children were running in the bottomland, and Cora was at the garden. And if you had come into the hollow at noon that day, you would have seen nothing wrong. A fine farm in a beautiful mountain hollow. A family doing what families did. Samuel drove to Silva the following morning and spent 3 hours at the county offices and at the drugstore and at the hardware store, asking questions. He asked the county's part-time mining inspector, a man named Bridges, who had a background in coal mining in eastern Kentucky, whether there were natural gas seeps in Jackson County, and whether a colorless, odorless gas could pool in a hollow and cause headaches and nosebleeds without killing anyone outright. He asked the druggist, who had a better working knowledge of chemistry than most people in the county, whether a candle extinguishing in a sealed room with no obvious draft was evidence of gas displacement. He asked the hardware man, who sold to miners, whether there were any known geological formations in the Tuckasegee Valley that were associated with gas seepage. The answers were possibly yes, and not that he knew of. He reported his theory to the county. He put it in a letter to the county commissioner and to the state mining authority in Raleigh, stating plainly that he believed the hollow had a natural gas seep of unknown composition that displaced oxygen at night in concentration sufficient to cause physiological symptoms in humans and to extinguish a candle, and that the hollow should be investigated by someone with proper chemical testing equipment. He was not a chemist. He could identify the phenomenon. He could not identify the agent. But he was certain something was seeping from the ground. The state mining authority sent a man. His name is not important. He was a practical inspector accustomed to coal mines, and he came with equipment designed for coal mine gas detection, for methane primarily, and for carbon monoxide. He spent 2 days in the hollow, tested the air in the cabin at night with his equipment, found no methane and no carbon monoxide, concluded that the air quality was within acceptable parameters, and filed a report declaring the hollow safe for habitation. He did not test for radon. In 1932, no one tested rural properties for radon. Radon was known to physicists and radiochemists as a radioactive decay product of uranium and radium, and its health effects were beginning to be understood in the context of uranium mining, where miners were dying of lung cancer at rates that didn't make sense until someone started measuring the air. But nobody was measuring the air in mountain hollows in North Carolina in 1932, and the inspector's equipment did not measure for radon, so the inspector found nothing. The Partons got this news in the late summer of 1932. The inspector had found nothing. The hollow was declared safe. Cora looked at Samuel over the dinner table when he told her, and neither of them said anything for a while. "Do you believe the report?" Cora asked, finally. Samuel looked at his hands. He was a man who spoke carefully, who tried to distinguish between what he knew and what he suspected, because the distinction had mattered in the trenches, and he had kept the habit. "I believe the inspector used the equipment he had and found what his equipment could find," he said. "I don't believe his equipment found everything." "So there might still be something wrong." "There is something wrong," Samuel said. "I don't know what it is. I know the candle went out. I know the headaches. I know the dogs wouldn't come in." He paused. "Jude and Mavis have never been wrong about anything in their lives. They've treed bear. They've tracked deer through 2 inches of snow. Mavis found my daughter when she was lost in the woods for 6 hours. She was 4 miles from the house, and Mavis went straight to her without a single false trail. Those dogs are not wrong." "So what do we do?" Cora asked. "We leave," Samuel said. There was no drama to this. No fight, no reconsideration, no long agonizing over the investment. The Partons had very little invested in the context of the Depression, and Samuel had the practical clarity about human life that came from having watched a lot of it end in a French forest in 1918. He was not going to spend his family's health on a piece of land that the dogs refused to enter. He was not going to make the mistake the Darnell man had made, the one in the story that everyone in the county told, where the farmer drove his wagon into the hollow over the objection of the dog and spent 9 months getting his children's noses to bleed. They moved out in October. Samuel wrote a second letter to the county and to the state mining authority, attached a copy of his candle test records and his symptom journal, and stated clearly that the hollow was unsafe for habitation and that the current testing methods were insufficient to identify the hazard. He asked that the hollow be designated as unsuitable for settlement until the hazard could be properly identified. Nobody did anything with this letter. It went into a file somewhere in the state archives in Raleigh, where it waited for 46 years for someone to go looking for it. The hollow sat empty. The cabin Jasper Darnell had built in 1908 weathered slowly into the bottomland over the following decades, its chimney standing long after the roof had caved in, a tall stone finger pointing up between the ridges. The chestnuts were gone. The poplars continued their slow growth. The creek continued to cut its path through the limestone, carving the channel a fraction of an inch deeper. Each decade, the fault that ran beneath the hollow continued, as it had continued for millions of years, to breathe. Eli Darnell sold the land to Curtis Parton in 1948. Curtis's son Samuel had been the last person to try to live on it, and he had at least understood that something was wrong, which was more than the first settler could say. The land changed hands once more in the late 1960s, passing from the Parton estate to a timber company that assessed the hollow's remaining old-growth timber, found it insufficient to justify an operation given the terrain, and decided to sell. The land was picked up cheaply by the Nantahala National Forest in 1971, absorbed into the vast holding of federal forest land that covers much of the western North Carolina mountains. A Forest Service crew drove into the hollow once in 1972 to assess the timber inventory, and one of the men on the crew came back from that trip and told his supervisor that there was something wrong with the air down there. "Got a headache like a hammer," he said. Both of us did. Started in the afternoon and was bad by the time we drove out. His supervisor noted this in the trip report and recommended the hollow not be used for camping or extended work operations. It was a small note in a large file, and nobody followed up on it until 1978. The 1978 USGS Seismological Survey of the Southern Appalachians was not, in its design, about Darnell Hollow. It was a regional project, part of a nationwide effort to better understand seismic activity in the eastern United States, motivated partly by the discovery that the eastern United States was seismically more active than had previously been assumed, and partly by the need to site nuclear power plants safely in the region. The survey team was studying fault systems throughout the southern Appalachians, placing monitoring instruments in strategic locations to capture ground motion data and map the geometry of underground fault structures. They placed instruments in dozens of locations across western North Carolina, eastern Tennessee, and northern Georgia. Dr. Margaret Chen was 34 years old in 1978. She had her doctorate from Columbia in geophysics, had spent 3 years working for the USGS in Menlo Park on California seismic studies, and had requested the Southern Appalachian assignment specifically because the region's geology interested her, not for the seismic hazard, which was relatively modest compared to the West Coast, but for the deep fault structures, the ancient Precambrian rocks that predated anything she'd worked with in California, and the questions those structures raised about the long-term geological history of the mountain chain. She was a careful, methodical scientist with the specific quality that distinguishes good field researchers from good lab researchers. She was genuinely curious about discrepancies. When the data didn't match the expected model, she didn't massage the data or ignore the mismatch. She went back out into the field to see what she'd missed. She first visited Darnell Hollow in August of 1978 as one of dozens of survey locations that season. She was looking for a place to install a seismometer as part of a cluster study of a deep crustal fault that the survey had tentatively mapped running through this part of Jackson County. She had topographical maps and geological survey data from previous USGS work, and the hollow's position, directly above the inferred fault trace, narrow and sheltered enough to reduce instrument noise from surface disturbances, made it a near-ideal sensor placement site. She drove up the Tuckasegee River Road on a bright August morning and parked at the hollow's mouth. She had a dog. His name was Fitzwilliam, which tells you something about Dr. Chen's reading habits, and he was a mixed-breed animal of no particular distinction, brown and medium-sized, and devoted to her in the way of dogs who have bonded strongly to one person. He had ridden in the back of her truck from Menlo Park to Asheville without complaint, had sat through 17 weeks of field survey work with patient good humor, had been in every cave, down every forest road, across every creek she had crossed that summer. He refused the hollow. She noticed this, noted it in her field journal as a matter of professional habit, because Margaret Chen was the sort of scientist who noted everything, even things that seemed irrelevant, because she had learned that the seemingly irrelevant things were often the things that mattered later. And she left Fitzwilliam in the truck and walked in alone to assess the site. The hollow was beautiful that August morning. She wrote this in her field journal too, without apology. Extraordinarily beautiful sight. Creek runs clear and cold over slate and limestone. Old-growth poplars along creek edge, multi-century specimens. Bottomland soil dark and rich, sheltered microclimate noticeably warmer than surrounding ridgelines. Perhaps 5 to 7 degrees Fahrenheit difference. Would be spectacular farmland. Don't understand why it hasn't been developed. She placed her preliminary instrument markers, took her rock samples from a limestone exposure near the creek, photographed the fault exposure she could see in the creek bank, a clean section through the valley's geological history. The older dark slates at the bottom and the younger limestone above, with a distinct fracture zone running between them that was exactly what she'd been looking for, and hiked back out to the truck by noon. Fitzwilliam was extremely pleased to see her. She had a headache by 2 o'clock, driving south toward Silva. She noted this in the journal. She had not had headaches during the summer's field work, was generally a healthy person, and the field work, for all its physical demands, agreed with her body. She wrote, "Headache onset approximately 2 hours after leaving hollow site. Moderate, frontal. Unusual. No previous headache this summer. Possibly dehydration. Though I drank adequately. Note to check on return visit." She returned to the hollow 2 weeks later, with an assistant named Davis to install the seismometer. Davis also developed a headache that afternoon, which he attributed to the drive. They installed the instrument and left. The seismometer began transmitting data to their base station in Asheville. Margaret Chen went back to her broader survey work and did not think particularly about the hollow for another month. Then the data started coming back strange. The seismometer was designed to detect ground motion in the range typical of small earthquakes and the microtremors associated with active fault zones. It was sensitive enough to detect a footstep at 10 yards. At Darnell Hollow, it was detecting something that at first glance looked like equipment noise. Low frequency signal, continuous, without the characteristic waveform of seismic events. The signal was present 24 hours a day, stronger at night, with a specific frequency signature that Margaret Chen did not immediately recognize. She spent a week with the data before she called her colleague, Robert Torres, at USGS in Denver. Torres was a specialist in infrasound, low-frequency sound waves below the threshold of human hearing that are produced by a variety of geological and atmospheric sources. He listened to her describe the signal and said, without much hesitation, "That's infrasound. You've got a resonating fault." She drove back to the hollow in October, this time with Torres, a portable infrasound detector, a radon testing kit. She had thought to bring the radon kit after reading Torres's background paper on fault-associated gas emissions, which mentioned radon as one of several gases that escape from active fault zones. And a notebook full of questions. Davis came too. Fitzwilliam came as well, and stood at the hollow's mouth with his tail tucked and his hackles up, looking at them with an expression that Margaret Chen described in her field notes as extremely disapproving. "Has your dog done this before?" Torres asked, watching Fitzwilliam. "Never," Margaret Chen said. "Not once all summer." They walked in without the dog. What they found, over 3 days of instrument deployment and sample collection, was a picture so complete and so explanatory that it had the quality of inevitability. The kind of scientific discovery that, once made, makes you wonder how anyone could have missed it. Though, of course, people always miss things until they have the instruments to see them. First, the infrasound. Torres's detector confirmed it immediately, within an hour of setup. The hollow was saturated with low-frequency sound in the range of 8 to 19 hertz, strongest along the creek bed, where the fault ran closest to the surface. The signal was continuous, not episodic, not the product of individual seismic events, but of constant micro-motion in the fault. Too small and too slow to register as earthquakes, but large enough, sustained over millions of repetitions, to generate a coherent sound field. 8 to 19 hertz is below the lower limit of human hearing, which begins at roughly 20 hertz. You cannot hear this sound with your ears, but you can feel it. At sufficient intensity, infrasound in this range produces well-documented physiological effects: anxiety, unease, a vague feeling of dread, the sensation that something is watching you, and, at higher intensities, visual disturbances and the feeling of a presence in the room. It is the geological explanation for some proportion of what people report as haunted places. The strange feeling, the inexplicable anxiety, the hair on the back of the neck. Your ears can't tell you what's happening, but your body can feel it. Dogs can hear much lower frequencies than humans. Their lower hearing threshold extends to roughly 40 hertz in most studies, though some research suggests sensitivity to frequencies as low as 15 to 20 hertz. More importantly, dogs' entire sensory and nervous systems are oriented toward detecting threat and infrasound in the range produced by the Darnell Hollow fault. The range associated with large predators' vocalizations, with distant thunder, with geological instability, is precisely the frequency range that triggers an ancient, deep, evolutionarily honed fear response in canines. Captain had not been trained to fear the hollow. He had felt something in his body at the hollow's mouth, below the threshold of hearing, that told him, in the oldest possible language, do not go in there. Second, the radon. The radon tests were the most significant finding of the survey, and the one that most directly explained the physiological symptoms reported by every person who had ever lived in the hollow. Radon is a radioactive noble gas, colorless and odorless to humans, produced by the radioactive decay of radium in certain rock formations, particularly uranium-bearing granite, and the metamorphic rocks associated with it. The Southern Appalachians, among the oldest mountain chains in the world, contain significant concentrations of uranium-bearing rocks deep in the geological record, and where faults intersect these rocks. Radon seeps upward through fractures in the overlying stone, following the path of least resistance toward the surface. At the Darnell Hollow Fault, the fracture zone in the creek bank that Margaret Chen had photographed in August was not just a geological curiosity. It was a conduit, a pathway from the uranium-bearing rocks several hundred feet below the surface to the hollow's air. The radon concentrations in the hollow's air, measured over 2 nights in October, were alarming. They were highest after midnight, when the temperature inversion that settled over the narrow hollow each night, cooler, denser air sinking and pooling between the ridges, with warmer air above acting as a lid, trapped the heavy radon gas at ground level. The concentrations measured in the cabin ruins, where the old chimney still stood and the remains of walls still defined a floor plan, were more than 40 times the level at which the EPA would eventually recommend remediation in residential spaces. Prolonged exposure at these concentrations would cause, over months, headaches, nausea, nosebleeds, sleep disruption, and, over years, a dramatically elevated risk of lung cancer. The hollow was not an immediately lethal gas chamber. It was a slow one. Radon is odorless and tasteless and invisible to human senses. It registers on nothing that a person in 1908 or 1932 could have detected without specialized equipment. No color in the air, no taste in the water, no unusual smell, no physical manifestation whatsoever, except the effects it was quietly having inside the bodies of anyone who breathed it long enough. But radon decays. That is the nature of radioactive elements. They decay, emitting energy as they do so, transforming into other elements as they shed particles. The decay products of radon are themselves radioactive, and in the air, these decay products attach to dust particles and other aerosols and float in the invisible chemistry of the atmosphere. They emit alpha particles. And alpha particles. Here's where it becomes relevant to Captain and Jude and Mavis and every dog that stopped at the mouth of that hollow. Have a smell. Not to humans. We are not built to detect it. But dogs have a sense of smell that is, depending on the specific odorant, somewhere between 10,000 and 100,000 times more sensitive than ours. They can smell things we cannot imagine smelling. They can smell cancer in a human body, hormonal changes, the minute chemical signature of fear in sweat. Studies conducted in the late 20th and early 21st centuries on dogs trained to detect radon have confirmed what the mountain curs and the blue-tick hounds and the mixed-breed companions of the Appalachian hollows had been demonstrating for generations. Dogs can smell the decay products of radon. They can smell radioactivity. In a hollow saturated with radon gas at 40 times the remediation threshold, the smell was not subtle. It was, to any dog with a functioning nose, overwhelming. Captain had smelled it from the road. Jude and Mavis had smelled it from the road. Fitzwilliam had smelled it from the road. They had each sat down and refused to proceed, because they could smell with perfect clarity something that every animal instinct told them was not safe. The smell of radioactive decay products is not a smell that any dog is trained to respond to. It is not part of any dog training protocol, because nobody trained those dogs, but it is, apparently, a smell that dogs respond to instinctively, the way a dog responds instinctively to the smell of a predator it has never met. Something in the chemical profile of radon's decay products signals danger in a deep and wordless way. The dogs knew this. They could not explain why they knew it. They simply knew. Third, and completing the picture, the hollow's microclimate, which Margaret Chen had noted with admiration on her first visit, was the mechanism by which the radon was concentrated and trapped. The hollow was, geologically and meteorologically speaking, a perfect radon trap. During the day, solar heating of the air in the hollow created convection, warm air rising, cooler air from the ridges flowing down to replace it, a gentle turnover that mixed and dispersed the radon into the larger atmosphere and kept concentrations manageable. This was why the symptoms always resolved by mid-morning. This was why someone walking into the hollow at noon would find nothing wrong. This was why the soil really was that fertile, partial oxidation of the organic material in the bottomland, aided by the radon's ionizing radiation over centuries, had accelerated decomposition and nitrogen cycling in ways that genuinely produced superior soil chemistry. The hollow was both the problem and its own advertisement. Its very fertility, a product of the same geological process that made it unlivable. But at night, when the sun set and the air cooled and the temperature inversion established itself, cool, dense air settling into the hollow like water filling a bowl, no wind to disturb it, the narrow mouth acting as a partial barrier to air exchange. The radon rose from the fault and accumulated at ground level, trapped by the inversion, filling the hollow from the bottom up like an invisible liquid. The cabin, sited in the bottomland for the obvious advantages of flat ground and fertile soil and proximity to the creek, was sited directly in the radon pool. Every night for months, the Darnell children slept in a room with radon concentrations that would horrify a modern health inspector. Every night, Flora Darnell and Samuel Parton woke with headaches that they attributed to anything and everything except what was actually causing them. Every night, the hollow breathed its bad breath, the earth's exhalation, steady and slow and invisible and undetectable to any human sense. Margaret Chen sat in the ruins of the Darnell cabin at midnight on the second night of the survey and breathed the hollow's air and felt the infrasound in her chest and watched her radon detector's display climbing as the temperature dropped. And she thought about all the people who had tried to understand this place without the instruments to do it. She thought about the Darnells and the Partons and the Forest Service crew that had come out with a headache they never explained. She thought about Fitzwilliam, sitting in the truck at the hollow's mouth, waiting with the particular patience of a dog who has decided that the humans are being unreasonable, but has accepted this as a condition of his life. She thought about her dog, stopping at the mouth of the hollow with his hackles up, and she thought about the fact that she had noted this observation in her field journal as a matter of professional habit, and that this habit, which some of her more theoretically inclined colleagues considered a weakness, the accumulation of qualitative, anecdotal, non-quantitative observations alongside the hard data, had led her to bring the radon kit and the infrasound detector, because a dog refusing a field site was the kind of discrepancy that her training told her to take seriously. Something had made that dog stop. Something was worth finding. She had gone looking, and she had found it. She pulled out her notebook and wrote, "Query: Is there oral history associated with this site? Local knowledge of avoidance patterns? Cherokee records? Will follow up with Eastern Band." She did follow up. She drove to the Kuala boundary in November, after the fieldwork was complete, but before the report was written, with a draft of her findings and a genuine desire to understand whether indigenous knowledge and the geological facts she'd uncovered were talking about the same thing. She had been directed to George Owl by the Eastern Band's Cultural Liaison Office, which fielded a significant number of inquiries from researchers, and had developed a careful process for connecting those researchers with knowledge keepers when the match seemed appropriate and the researcher seemed trustworthy. Margaret Chen was, George Owl decided after their first meeting, trustworthy in the relevant sense, not because she was deferential or performed respect in the ways that some researchers did. He had seen enough performative respect to be immune to it. but because she asked questions and then actually listened to the answers. She did not nod while he was speaking in the way that indicated she was composing her next question. She wrote things down without interrupting. When she didn't understand something, she said so. When she disagreed with something, she said that too, and explained why, and asked for his response, and listened to it. "Do you know Darnell Hollow?" she asked him at their second meeting. She had brought a topographical map, and she put it on the table between them, and pointed to the hollow's location on the Tuckasegee, the narrow cut between the two ridges. George Owl looked at the map for a moment, then looked at her. "We have a name for that place," he said. "What is it?" He told her the Cherokee word. Then he said, "In English, the closest you can come is the breathing ground. The ground breathes there. Our people have known this for a very long time." He said it simply, the way you state a fact that has been a fact for as long as you can remember. He did not perform ancient wisdom at her, did not invest the statement with mystical weight. He said it as a man states a geological observation. This is what is there. This is what we know about it. This is why we stayed away. "How long have you known?" Margaret Chen asked. "As long as there are stories," George Owl said. "Longer than the stories remember specifically. The hollow was not a place to hunt, and not a place to gather, and not a place to stay. This is in the old knowledge, not as something to explain, but as something to observe. You do not need to know why a place is bad to know that it is bad. You need to watch it long enough." "What did your people observe that led to that conclusion?" she asked. He thought about this for a moment, considering how to translate. "The animals avoided it," he said. "Deer, bear. The animals that should have been there, in a hollow with good water and good cover and good food, were not there. This is the first sign. When the animals avoid a place, people should ask why. Usually there is an answer, even if it takes time to find." He paused. "Then, the people who went there came back wrong. Not immediately wrong. Slowly wrong. Over many days, over a season. Sick in their heads, sick in their sleep. The old people said the earth was breathing on them. Bad breath from underground. You would not put your face in the ground and breathe there. This is the same." "The earth's bad breath," Margaret Chen repeated. "Yes." She told him what she'd found. She told him about the radon and the fault, and the infrasound, and the temperature inversion, using terms that were technical, but explaining each of them as she went. Because George Owl was a man of considerable intelligence, who absorbed technical information rapidly, and didn't need to have it dumbed down, only translated into a framework he hadn't started from. He listened carefully. He asked several precise questions, particularly about the radon. What it was, where it came from, whether it was unique to this hollow or present in other places. She answered as fully as she could. When she was finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "So the instruments say the same thing as the stories?" "Yes," Margaret Chen said. "This is not surprising," George Owl said. "The stories were made by observation. The instruments observe the same thing. They use different methods and different language. The result is the same." He looked at the map between them. "The hollow breathes. It has always breathed. My grandfather's grandfather knew this. His grandfather knew it. The instruments are very new. The knowledge is very old." He paused. I think the knowledge is correct. I think so too, Margaret Chen said. She asked him about the dogs. She asked whether the Cherokee had observed that dogs were particularly sensitive to the hollow's atmosphere. He smiled for the first time in their conversation. The dogs always knew, he said. Dogs know many things before people do. This is not a secret. Anyone who lives with dogs knows this. The dogs smelled the earth's bad breath and would not go in. This is a reasonable response. He paused. The people who brought their dogs and listened to their dogs were safe. The people who brought their dogs and did not listen were not. This is also not a secret. It is the oldest advice in the world. Watch the animals. They have been watching longer than we have. Margaret Chen wrote this in her field notes, word for word. She incorporated it, with George Owl's permission and attribution, into the final USGS survey report, which was published in early 1979 as part of a larger bulletin on fault-associated gas emissions in the southern Appalachians. The section on Darnell Hollow was brief, 4 pages in a 90-page technical report, but it was complete. It described the fault, the radon seepage, the infrasound, the temperature inversion, the concentrations measured, the symptom history of the 2 settlement attempts, the Forest Service incident report, the Cherokee oral history, and the behavior of the dogs. It recommended that the hollow be designated as unsuitable for habitation due to radon levels, that no camping or extended stay activities be permitted within its boundaries, and that a note be added to the Forest Service management plan for the area. The recommendation was adopted within the year. The geological report did not become famous. It was a technical document, read by geologists and Forest Service managers and a small number of public health researchers interested in radon exposure in rural communities. But the finding it described, that radon seeping from a fault had made a specific hollow effectively uninhabitable, and that this had been understood by Cherokee oral tradition for generations, and by the behavior of dogs for as long as anyone had tried to take dogs there, quietly entered several literatures. It was cited in papers on radon geology. It was cited in papers on indigenous ecological knowledge. It was cited briefly in a paper on canine olfactory sensitivity to radioactive decay products. Margaret Chen gave one public talk about it at a conference in Knoxville in 1980, and in the audience was a journalist from the Asheville Citizen-Times who wrote a short piece for the paper. The piece ran on page 7. The headline was, "Mountain Hollow Long Avoided has Natural Explanation. Scientists Find." 3 people wrote letters to the editor in response to the piece. One of them had heard the old story about the Darnells and said he had wondered for years what had really happened there. One of them said that this sort of thing was exactly why you should never dismiss what the old-timers knew. One of them was George Owl, who wrote in his precise and elegant English that his people had been waiting for the instruments to catch up with the knowledge for a long time, and that he was glad they finally had. The 1979 USGS report, also located in the State Archives in Raleigh, Samuel Parton's 1932 letter to the county commissioner and the State Mining Authority. It was referenced in an appendix. The report noted that Samuel Parton had correctly identified the symptom cluster associated with gas exposure, had correctly inferred that a gas was displacing oxygen in the hollow at night, and had correctly recommended that the hollow be investigated with better equipment. He had been right. He had been right in 1932, with a miner's candle and a WWI veteran's understanding of what gas exposure felt like. And nobody had listened, and nobody had come back with better equipment for 46 years. Samuel Parton died in 1967. He never knew he'd been right. He had been right anyway. There is a particular quality to the story of Darnell Hollow that sets it apart from the stories that usually get told about unusual or dangerous places in the mountains. The usual story goes, strange things happened, people were scared, the superstitious retreated, and then science came along and explained what was actually going on, and the mystery was dispelled. In this version, science is the ending and the answer, and what came before science was error. Well-meaning error, maybe, but error nonetheless, corrected by rigor and instruments. That is not quite the right version of what happened at Darnell Hollow. At Darnell Hollow, what happened was a geological hazard existed. A community of people who had lived in long-term relationship with the landscape identified the hazard through observation, correctly categorized it as an earth-borne air hazard, and maintained a practice of avoidance that kept them safe. Dogs, with sensory equipment optimized by millions of years of evolution to detect exactly this kind of chemical signal, identified the hazard instantaneously upon approach and communicated their identification in the only language available to them, the language of refusal. A series of settlers, armed with the confidence of people who believed the land was theirs to understand and settle and use, entered the hollow and were made sick by something they could not see or smell or hear or taste. One of them came close. Samuel Parton, with his miner's candle and his gas warfare knowledge, came very close. But the instrument gap was too large to close in 1932. And then, in 1978, the instruments arrived, and they found exactly what the dogs had been saying all along, and what the Cherokee had been saying for longer than any instrument had existed. This is not the story of science correcting superstition. This is the story of three different epistemologies: indigenous observation, animal sensing, and instrument-based measurement, arriving at the same conclusion through different methods, separated by a gulf of time and cultural misunderstanding. The Cherokee knew. The dogs knew. It took Western science 90 years and $40,000 of equipment to catch up. When the instruments finally spoke, they confirmed everything that the dogs and the oral tradition had been saying. Not some of it. All of it. This matters beyond Darnell Hollow. It matters because the impulse to dismiss non-instrumental knowledge, to say that it doesn't count as real knowledge until it can be measured, that oral tradition is just story, that an animal's response is just behavior, is an impulse with a cost. The cost in Darnell Hollow was 2 families made sick, 2 children with nosebleeds, a woman with nightmares about the breathing earth, a man who spent a February night alone in a cabin, feeling the ground move under him before he finally listened. The knowledge that would have prevented all of that was available from the beginning. It was in George Owl's family, passed down through generations of careful watchers. It was in Captain's hackles and his howl. It was in the plain and unambiguous language of a dog sitting down in the road and refusing to proceed. The problem was not a knowledge gap. The problem was a listening gap. The knowledge was there. No one who needed it was listening. This is the part of the story that extends beyond 1978, beyond Margaret Chen's report, and George Owl's letter to the editor and the Forest Service designation. Because the impulse to trust the instruments over the dog, the surveys over the oral tradition, the land grant over the local knowledge, this impulse did not end in 1978. It is a structural thing, not a temporal one. It is the impulse that says, I know how to evaluate reality, and your tools are not adequate, and mine are. It is the impulse that says, I have measured this and found it safe. Therefore, it is safe. Therefore, anyone who says otherwise is mistaken. The mining inspector in 1932 was not a bad man or an incurious one. He measured what he had tools to measure and declared safety in good faith. He was wrong, but his wrongness was not malice. It was the wrongness of a limited instrument being asked a question too large for it. The error was not in his character, but in his confidence. He trusted his equipment over the Parton dogs, and the Parton dogs were right, and his equipment was wrong. The capacity to hold both things simultaneously, the instrument and the dog, the measurement and the oral tradition, the radon meter, and the name, the breathing ground, is harder than it sounds. It requires a kind of intellectual humility that runs against a deep current in how Western science has tended to situate itself relative to other ways of knowing. Margaret Chen had it. It was why she wrote Fitzwilliam's refusal in her field notes. It was why she drove to the koala boundary to talk to George Owl. It was why the final report read the way it did, with the Cherokee oral tradition and the dog's behavior given equal footing with the instrument data, because they had, as far as she was concerned, equal epistemic standing. They had all been detecting the same thing. They had all been right. The Southern Appalachians are full of places that local knowledge designates as wrong, as unhealthy, as places to avoid. Some of these designations are superstition in the strict sense, unfounded, unconnected to any observable phenomenon. But many of them are not. Many of them are observations that predate the instruments, but would be confirmed by the instruments if anyone took the trouble to go in with the right equipment and spend a few nights measuring. The mountains are old, and the people who have lived in them have been watching for a long time. And the things they have noticed about particular pieces of ground are not always wrong just because they are expressed in terms that don't include the phrase parts per million. Radon, methane, carbon dioxide, arsenic in the water table, mercury in the creek sediment, infrasound from fault activity. These things leave marks on people and animals and oral traditions long before any chemist arrives to name them. The dog is also an instrument. It is an instrument that has been calibrated by evolution over tens of thousands of years to detect precisely the kinds of threats that the Appalachian environment produces. When the dog stops, there is information in the stopping. When the dog's hackles rise and it sits down in the road and howls, that is data. The data is not in a format that submits easily to peer review, but it is data, and its accuracy record at Darnell Hollow was 100%. Every dog that approached that hollow stopped. Not some of them. All of them. For as long as anyone brought a dog to that hollow, the dog stopped, and the dog said no, in the language of dogs, clearly and without ambiguity. The hollow listened. The fault listened. The radon continued its slow seep from the uranium-bearing rocks far below. The infrasound continued its bass note below the range of hearing. The Cherokee name continued to be passed down, generation to generation, in the community that had never stopped watching. And the dogs, one after another, arrived at the hollow's mouth and stopped and looked at their humans and said, in the only way they knew how, I know something you don't. I know something you won't know for 100 years. I know it right now, with my nose, and I am telling you, and I hope you are listening. Captain was listening, or rather, Captain had known from the beginning. And the question was never whether he was telling the truth, but whether the people he was telling would listen. Some did, some didn't. The hollow kept its record either way. There is one more thing to understand about the hollow before we leave it. Something that takes the story beyond the individual families and the individual dogs and the individual scientific survey, and places it in the larger context of what places like this teach us about the relationship between knowledge and time. The fault beneath Darnell Hollow is roughly 300 million years old. It formed during the collision of the North American and African tectonic plates, the event that built the Appalachian Mountains during the Pennsylvanian period, when those mountains were as tall as the Himalayas, and the landscape of the eastern seaboard was compressed and crumpled like a sheet of paper. The Appalachians have been eroding ever since, losing thousands of feet of their original height to the patient work of water and ice and wind over hundreds of millions of years, until what remains is what you see today. Old, rounded, worn mountains, nothing like the jagged young peaks they once were, but still complex beneath the surface, still fractured in the patterns set by that ancient collision. The fault beneath the hollow is one small part of that fracture system. It is not moving in any meaningful sense. There has not been an earthquake of any consequence in this part of the mountains in recorded history. But it is alive in the geological sense, meaning that it continues to mediate the slow exchange of material between the deep earth and the surface. Gases rise through it. Water moves along it. The rock on either side of it shifts microscopic amounts in response to the stresses that have never fully resolved since the plates separated and the mountains began their long erosion. It will do this for another 300 million years if the Earth remains stable enough for mountain ranges to persist. The fault is not a problem. The fault is the mountain structure. The radon is not a mistake. The radon is a natural product of the uranium in the rock, which has been decaying since the rock formed, emitting radon into the groundwater and the atmosphere since long before any organism on this planet had lungs to breathe with. The hollow has been doing this, breathing its invisible radon, sounding its infrasound, since before there were dogs to smell it, and before there were Cherokee to name it, and long, long before there were settlers from the old world to build cabins on the bottomland. The deer that did not graze in the hollow were not reacting to anything new. Whatever wolves and mountain lions and black bears avoided the bottomland in the centuries before European contact were reading the same chemical signal that Captain read in April of 1908. The hollow has been keeping its counsel, in the only way geology knows how to keep counsel, for ages that make human habitation look like a conversation that lasted an afternoon. And here is what is strange and worth sitting with. The hollow is beautiful. This is not incidental to the story. It is central to it. It is beautiful in a very specific way. a way that is connected to the same geological process that makes it dangerous. The fertility of the bottomland, the darkness of the soil, the extraordinary growth rate of the vegetation. These are partly products of the radon's ionizing radiation, which over centuries has driven an accelerated cycling of nutrients in the soil and in the organic layer above it, the microclimate that makes it warmer than the surrounding ridges, the shelter from wind that creates that warmth. These are products of the hollow's geometry, which is itself a product of the fault, because it is the fault that created the topographical depression that became the hollow in the first place. The beautiful thing and the dangerous thing are the same thing. The hollow is fertile because the fault is there. The hollow is dangerous because the fault is there. You cannot have one without the other. This is a kind of truth that the romantic vision of Appalachian landscapes does not always accommodate. The idea that the most beautiful places are sometimes beautiful for reasons that are also reasons to stay away. The dramatic gorges and sheltered coves and rich bottomlands of the southern mountains were often carved by geological forces that also left their chemical signatures in the air and water. The richest soils are sometimes rich because something is seeping from below. The most sheltered hollows are sometimes sheltered by geometry that also traps what should not be trapped. The very features that make a place look like paradise, the fertility, the shelter, the water, the warmth, can be the very features that make it inhospitable when you understand what is producing them. The Cherokee understood this, not as a geological abstraction, but as practical knowledge about specific places. They had learned, over generations, to read the landscape with enough nuance to understand that a beautiful place could be a dangerous one, and that the beauty and the danger were sometimes inseparable. They had learned this in Darnell Hollow. They had learned it in other places too. There are other sites in the southern Appalachians with similar designations in Cherokee oral tradition, places that translate as variations on "do not stay here," or "the ground is sick here," or "this place will make you wrong." Some of these sites have been investigated by geologists and confirmed to have elevated radon or other natural hazards. Some have not been investigated. The knowledge is waiting, as it has always been waiting, in the oral tradition, available to anyone who thinks to ask. The 1979 USGS report, for all its value, did not change this dynamic in any systemic way. It confirmed one hollow's hazard and recommended one management designation and was filed in the technical literature. It did not prompt a broad survey of Cherokee oral tradition for other geological hazard sites. It did not lead to a systematic program of listening to indigenous knowledge as a guide for geological investigation. It was a good study of one specific place, and it was acted on appropriately, and it did not become a model for anything beyond itself. This is the way of things, often. The lesson is learned in one place, filed in one report, and the larger lesson that the dogs are instruments, that the oral tradition is data, that the people who have been watching longest might know things the newcomers don't, remains unlearned at the scale where it would matter. But Darnell Hollow is still there, and the story is still there, and the fault is still there, and the radon is still seeping, and every dog that approaches the hollow's mouth still stops and sits and refuses to proceed. The geological fact does not care about the management designation. The fault does not care about the Forest Service plan. The hollow breathes because it breathes, because it has breathed for 300 million years, because the uranium in the rock decays at a rate determined by physics and not by human preference or human knowledge or human timescales. The old-growth poplars that Margaret Chen photographed in 1978 are still there, a little bigger now. The creek still runs clear and cold over slate and limestone. The bottomland soil is still extraordinarily dark and fertile, and in the spring, after a season of snowmelt and rain, the vegetation in the hollow grows with the same alarming vigor that Flora Darnell noticed in her kitchen garden in the spring of 1908. The hollow still looks, at noon on a summer day, like paradise. Samuel Parton's letter, photocopied from the state archives and included in the USGS report's appendix, is a remarkable document when you read it knowing what it was answered with. He wrote it in the careful, precise hand of a man who measured his words against their likely effect. And he said, in essence, "Something is wrong here, and I cannot name it. But I know it is real, and I know that what I have is not enough to find it. And I'm asking you to come and look with better tools." He was asking the right people for the right thing for the right reason. They sent a man with the wrong tools, who found nothing, and declared the hollow safe. And the hollow went on being not safe, in the way that geological hazards go, on being geological hazards regardless of what county inspectors find. Samuel Parton left, taking his family, with the knowledge that he had been right and the frustration of knowing that being right was not the same as being listened to. George Owl, when he learned that Samuel Parton's letter had been found in the state archives and referenced in the USGS report, said something that Margaret Chen included in her field notes from their final meeting. The farmer who left in 1932 was a good observer. He did not know the name of the thing that was hurting his family, but he knew the thing was there, and he found a way to confirm it, and he told the people who should have listened. They did not listen. 46 years later, the instruments confirmed what he said, what we said, what the dog said. The information was always available. The question is always whether people are willing to receive it. Whether people are willing to receive it. This is the quiet center of everything Darnell Hollow has to teach. Not the geology, not the chemistry, not even the extraordinary fact of dogs smelling radioactive decay products. All of that is fascinating, but it is not the lesson. The lesson is in the gap between knowing and receiving. The knowledge was complete, or close to complete, from the beginning. Captain knew at the road. The Cherokee knew from before the road existed. Samuel Parton knew in 1932, with his candle and his notebook, and his WWI veteran's body, that recognized gas exposure because it had endured it. Flora Darnell knew when her daughter's nose bled for 40 minutes and would not stop. The knowledge was there in each of these forms, and each of these forms was dismissed. The dog as animal instinct, the Cherokee as superstition, the WWI veteran as oversensitive, the mother's fear as anxiety. The instruments were trusted over all of them. The instruments found nothing. The hollow went on being the hollow. This is not a story about bad people. Nobody in this story is a villain. Jasper Darnell was not a bad man. He was a proud one, a stubborn one, a man who had invested everything and could not afford to be wrong. The county mining inspector of 1932 was not negligent. He was limited, working with the tools available to him, and he reported honestly what he found. The Forest Service crews were not careless. They were busy, and the headache was only a headache, and the hollow was only one of thousands of acres they managed. None of the people in this story failed at anything but the most difficult thing: receiving information from a source you have been trained not to trust. And that training, to trust the instrument over the animal, the survey over the story, the documented expert over the local knower, is so deep and so pervasive that it does not feel like a choice. It feels like reason itself. Margaret Chen made a different choice. She trusted Fitzwilliam. She drove to the koala boundary and asked George Owl what his people knew. She included both the dog's behavior and the Cherokee oral history in a peer-reviewed USGS technical report because she had decided that they were data, and that excluding data because of its format was not science, but bias. She was right, and the report was stronger for it, and the recommendation that followed from the report was better grounded than any recommendation based on instrument data alone could have been. The convergence of three independent knowledge systems, animal sensing, indigenous observation, and instrumental measurement, all pointing to the same conclusion, was more compelling than any one of them alone. She understood this, and she wrote it that way, and the report is better for it. There is a version of this story that ends with the triumphant confirmation of indigenous wisdom by Western science, a tidy reconciliation narrative in which everyone is ultimately right, and the ending is harmonious. George Owl, to his credit, did not tell that story and did not encourage others to tell it. What he said in his letter to the editor and in several subsequent interviews over the years was something more complicated and more important. The knowledge did not need to be confirmed by the instruments to be true. It was true before the instruments. It will be true after the instruments are gone. The instruments confirmed something that was already known. They did not create the knowledge or validate it in any fundamental sense. The confirmation was useful. It led to the hollow being properly designated, which would prevent future families from doing what the Darnells and the Partons had done. But it should not be mistaken for the source of the truth. The truth was older than that. He was right about this too. The knowledge in the Cherokee oral tradition about the breathing ground did not become true in 1978 when the USGS measured the radon. It had been true since the first person noticed that the hollow made people sick and animals avoid it, whenever that was. A century before European contact, 10 centuries, however long ago, the observation was first made and first named. The instruments found what was already there. The name was already there. The avoidance was already there. The dogs were already stopping at the mouth. The instruments were a gift. The knowledge was older. Darnell Hollow is now part of the Nantahala National Forest. There is no trail into it. No sign marks its entrance. The USGS report recommended that the hollow be designated unsuitable for habitation due to radon levels, and the Forest Service complied. The fault beneath the hollow continues to breathe, releasing radon into the narrow valley every night, where it pools in the dark like invisible water. In the morning, the sun warms the air, the gas rises and disperses, and the hollow looks like paradise. Green, sheltered, beautiful. By afternoon, you might walk in and think, this would be a perfect place to build a home. But if you brought a dog, the dog would stop at the mouth. The dog would sit down. The dog would look at you with an expression that, if you have spent any time with dogs, you would recognize as I am not going in there. And if you were smart, you wouldn't either. The bottomland is still extraordinary. The creek is still cold. The poplars are a little larger than they were when Margaret Chen photographed them. The stone chimney that Jasper Darnell built in 1908 is gone now. It finally came down in a windstorm in the 1990s, the stones scattering across the bottom where the cabin once stood. But the depression in the earth where the cabin's floor sat is still faintly visible, a slight irregularity in the bottomland that a careful observer would notice and wonder about. The soil there is darker than the surrounding ground. Something was built here, once. Something was tried. The hollow has absorbed the evidence of the attempt with the patient indifference of geological time, and it looks now as it looked before the Darnells came, as it looked before the Cherokee came, as it looked before any human walked the Tuckasegee Valley, and looked up at the ridges and thought about what lay between them. On autumn nights, when the temperature drops and the air settles and the inversion establishes itself, the radon rises. It fills the hollow from the bottom. It pools at ground level, invisible, scentless to human noses, doing what it has always done. The fault ticks its infrasound beneath the creek. The old-growth poplars stand in the dark. The hollow breathes. There are no people there to get headaches. No children with nosebleeds. No woman lying awake listening to the sound she cannot place. The pulse that is not the creek and not the wind. The breathing that the hollow does in the dark when no one is there to hear it. The hollow breathes for itself now, or for no one, which is the same thing. It is doing what it was always doing, before any of us arrived and after all of us have gone. Jasper Darnell's blue-tick hound, Captain, lived another 9 years after the family left the hollow. He lived on the ridge farm in Cullowhee, where he slept by the fire and went out with the children and treed the occasional coon and fulfilled the whole great obligation of a good dog's life with the quiet thoroughness that characterized everything he did. He was a fine dog. The family said so, uniformly, in every account that survives. He was steady, he was loyal, he was good with the children and wary of strangers, and he never bit anyone who didn't have it coming. He never went into the hollow. He never went anywhere near it after that April morning in 1908 when he sat down in the road and would not move, when he looked at his master and at the hollow and began to howl, when Flora Darnell said, "If the dog won't go, we shouldn't either," and Jasper drove them in anyway. He had done his job. He had said what he had to say in the only language available to him. What happened next was not his fault, but for the rest of his life, whenever the wind blew from that direction. From the northwest, down the Tuckasegee Valley and out of the hollow's mouth, he would lift his nose, and his hackles would rise, and he would move to the far side of wherever he was standing. He could smell from miles away something that humans needed $40,000 worth of scientific equipment to detect. He could smell the decay products of a radioactive noble gas seeping from a 300-million-year-old fault in the basement rock of the southern Appalachian Mountains. He could smell it clearly and immediately and completely, and he knew what it meant, and he moved away from it every time, without fail, for 9 years, until the day he died. We built the instruments to confirm what the dog already knew. That is not a small thing. In the accounting of what we understand about the world we live in, and how we have come to understand it, and who, and what we have been willing to learn from. In that accounting, which stretches back to the first time a human being watched an animal stop at the edge of something and thought, maybe I should stop too. That is not a small thing at all. It is, in fact, almost everything. The hollow breathes. It breathed before we had words for what it was breathing. It will breathe after the words are gone. The dog knew this, and the dogs that came after knew it. And somewhere in the long, bright chain of observation that runs from the Cherokee elders to Margaret Chen's field notes to the dust-covered USGS technical report on a shelf in Raleigh, the same knowledge pulses, patient and persistent, like a false infrasound, below the threshold of the hearing we think of as the only hearing that counts. Listen for it. It is always there.